Wallace. Good morning. So I'd like to share with you something I'd never encountered before. It's a sutta from the Pali Canon, which is, I think, very, very relevant to what we're doing here. It's the Sutta Sutta, the Cook Sutta, the Cook Discourse. It's very short. I won't read the whole thing, but it's a very, to my mind, just a very nice parable or metaphor. And I will paraphrase a good deal of it, and then I will read verbatim the part that's most directly relevant to our practice here. So it's the Cook Discourse. And in this discourse, the Buddha gives a very simple parable, and that is of a cook who's preparing a main meal for a king or a king's minister. But the foolish, inexperienced cook doesn't take into account what the king or the king's minister really likes in terms of, the kind of flavors and so forth. So not taking that into account, then the cook cooks up a meal, but it's not what the king wanted, and therefore the cook does not get food, clothing, he does not get good payment, because he did not satisfy the king. And why? Because he did not acquire the sign of the king. I think, I'm not even going to ask, but I assume everybody has seen, or at least knows about the film Avatar. You remember one of those very touching moments when it says, "I see you"? Maybe the most touching in the movie. Yeah. It was very, very nice. It was really Dharma. I see you. Well, I'm just drawing from that. And that is, the cook did not see the king. He did not see what would the king really like, what would satisfy him, what would truly please him. And as a result, then he was not rewarded, right? And so, but he used that term, he didn't see the sign of the king. He didn't see him, he didn't get him. He didn't see what he truly wanted, right? So then the Buddha says, that this is an analogy obviously, and so then the Buddha says, and here I quote, it's my translation, but I think it's very faithful. In the same way, there are cases where a foolish, inexperienced, unskillful monk remains focused on the body as the body, feelings as feelings, the mind as the mind, phenomena as phenomena, 4 applications of mindfulness, ardent, introspective, and mindful, putting aside attachment and disappointment regarding the world. This is a very classic kind of sequence there. You find it also in the Prajnaparamita Sutras. Same. As he remains thus focused on the body as the body, his mind does not become concentrated. His defilements are not abandoned. He does not take note of that fact. As a result, he does not abide in happiness here and now, nor with mindfulness and introspection. Why is that? Because the unwise, inexperienced, unskillful monk has not acquired the sign of his own mind. Interesting, yeah? And then he gives and then he just turns this right around. I think once again I need to do a little typo, so don't post this just yet, Claudio. Just a typo. And then he just flips it around in a very straightforward way. And then there's the skillful cook who does really attend to what the king wants. He prepares the meal, and then he's well rewarded. And so just exactly the opposite. In the same way, there are cases where a wise, experienced, skillful monk remains focused on the body as the body. In other words, Vipashyana practice, right? The body as the body, feelings as feelings, the mind as the mind, phenomena as phenomena, ardent, introspective, and mindful, putting aside attachment and disappointment regarding the world, as he thus remains mindful of phenomena as phenomena. His mind becomes concentrated, his defilements are abandoned, he takes note of that fact. As a result, he abides in happiness here and now and is mindful and introspective as well. Why is that? Because the wise, experienced, skillful monk has acquired the sign of his own mind. So clearly it's open to interpretation, but I'm going to take a shot at it. I would suggest that the sign of the mind, like the counterpart sign for the earth element and so forth, is that from which the mind, as we experience it, emerges. So I've suggested this hypothesis before. In the Pali terminology, it would be the bhavanga. That brightly shining mind, which is by nature luminous and pure, but adventitiously becomes obscured, and then is not obscured. But the crucial point here, and we remember it from an earlier citation, it is this brightly shining mind that is the source of our motivation to seek a path, to find liberation, and so forth. You remember that? Remember that? I think very significant. And so one may, of course, practice vipassana, that is, 4 applications of mindfulness, or anything else, without having acquired the sign of one's own mind, without tapping into the depths of one's soul, tapping into one's heart's desire, tapping into the deepest motivation that is already there, not something you learn from Buddhism or Christianity or modern psychology. Tapping into the bhavanga. That stem consciousness, which is not yet differentiated as human, animal, preta, deva, and so forth. When we consider the range of sentient beings across the whole bandwidth within the Buddhist worldview, but also the range of just human beings, it's a tremendous variety of what, if you did a poll, just ask just in Italy, what do you want? What would really make you happy? You definitely get a lot of different answers. And then go to different countries, ask children, ask old people, ask men, ask women, and so forth. You're going to get a lot of answers, let alone if you could interview dogs and earthworms and pretas and devas and so forth, and people in the form realm and the formless realm, you can get a lot of different, answers to what do you want. But all of those sentient beings, when they come out of their configured state, from hell realms up to deva realms, when they melt from the configured state, come back, like the yo-yo coming back to the palm, after going out to all these different rebirths, when it comes back to the palm, and they're back to the kind of primal ground within samsara, if you could ask that being, who's not yet differentiated as man, woman, human, deva, and so forth, if you could ask that being, what do you want? What do you want? Then you'd get a more primal answer. Right? It won't be a human, it won't be like, I would like a farm. It's going to be something very primal that will be common then. Kind of a stem desire. A common desire that would be equally for those in the formless realm, as the hell realm, as everything in between. It's going to be a stem desire. I'm just following the logic here, right? So what is it you really want? And then you find that out by tapping into your depths, and you discover the sign of your mind, and you discover what truly makes you happy. And you can at least here in the Pali Canon, you can go as far as your substrate consciousness. Of course, if you go beyond that, beyond the bandwidth of the Pali Canon, into the Mahayana, into Dzogchen, then of course, keep on cutting, keep on going deeper. Beyond the substrate consciousness, beyond the bhavanga, go right down to Rigpa, and ask Rigpa, what do you want? What's your desire? So this is not the only reference to the sign of the mind, the chitta nimitta. Chitta nimitta. There are more references to this in the Samyutta Nikaya, Anguttara Nikaya. There's just one here that I've translated from the Therigatha, sayings of the elders. And this is very pithy. Having acquired the sign of the mind, sensing the savor of solitude. And this would be, remember there's two types of solitude? There's outer solitude, where you simply withdraw yourself from activity, society, the busyness of the world, into solitude, very simple. But remember also the inner solitude. There's two types of solitude, remember? The inner solitude is withdrawing your mind from all mundane concerns. And between the two, that's the more important. So you could, in principle, have a very successful Shamatha retreat, for example, in downtown Manhattan, if you had a quiet place, a quiet apartment. You could. All around you is incredible busyness. But if your mind is in solitude, then even if just the next door neighbors are completely immersed in hedonic pursuits, you're not. And so, having acquired the sign of the mind, sensing the savor of solitude, taking delight in that, practicing jhana, masterful, mindful, you attain a pleasure that is not hedonic. That's the benefit of acquiring the sign of the mind. That just strikes me as having achieved shamatha. Nothing beyond that. Because on that basis, then you practice viewing the body as the body, and so forth and so on. Vipashyana. But then you're really ready to launch into Vipassana. But he's saying, and that was with respect to Vipassana, the four applications of mindfulness, if you've not acquired the sign of the mind, it's not going to work. That's what he said. Right? Those are the Buddha's words. You will miss the target. So people can practice Vipassana for all kinds of motivations. But if you haven't tapped into the innermost depths of what you truly want, it can easily be reduced to the same practice, the same techniques can be easily reduced to simply a very beneficial form of psychotherapy, which is good, it helps. But it's also missing the whole point. because you don't need Vipashyana. There are 250 schools of psychotherapy, so I understand. And Vipassana, devoid of context, with no shamatha, with very little reference to ethics or motivation, becomes number 251. Got a lot of competition, you know. And how significant is that really, you know, to have just one more? And what on earth does that have to do with Gautama leaving home at the age of 29 and giving up everything? So I think this sign of the mind is something very, very interesting. I think it's substrate consciousness. He's suggesting strongly here, this is the preliminary, this is the really most crucial, proximate, preliminary practice for venturing fully into Vipassana. That then ensures that your Vipassana will be motivated by a truly authentic motivation, which is right intention, authentic intention, one of the Eightfold Noble Path. Because bear in mind, the same techniques can be done for all kinds of reasons. But this ensures at least it will be authentic, it will be renunciation. And of course, if you shift over to expand the bandwidth, then it becomes bodhicitta. Sign of the mind. Also, I mean, I'm just musing here, but I was really moved by this. I hadn't seen it before. But I kind of picked up the fragrance of sign of the mind and saw where it led me. And it led me to the Shuddha Sutta. But also just one other point, and that is we, you know, for those of us poor souls in America following this electoral process, and see how many different types of desires people have. The American electorate has. I mean, clearly they want different things. And then we look at ISIS, and they want different things. And people around the world want different things. It's very easy as we look at what people are doing and who they're voting for and what they're striving to, what they're giving their effort to. It's very easy, frankly, to feel very little empathy. I think many people, 70% of Americans are very, very dissatisfied with Trump, with Donald Trump. I think they don't empathize with the way he speaks, the way he behaves, what he seems to want. They find it perhaps repugnant, his behavior. And they probably find very little to empathize. Like, he's like, boy, thank goodness I'm not like him. I think maybe 70% of the population are thinking like that. Thank goodness I'm not like him. No empathy. And then it's very easy in the next breath, then looking down. You know, looking down, he's an inferior person. I'm not saying he is. I'm saying this would naturally follow if you feel, well, thank goodness I'm not like him. That means I'm superior to him, right? So then we have contempt. And likewise, how many people really empathize with people who are cutting people's heads off and so forth and so on, and ISIS. Racism all over the place. And there's nothing to empathize with that. I don't want to empathize with racism or terrorism or, you know, egotism and being bombastic and megalomaniac and so forth. I don't want to empathize with that. But can we empathize with a person? Not with the motivation. I don't feel with you. I don't want to cut off women's heads. I'm not going to feel with you on that one. Sorry, that's evil. But there's a person there who's right now so delusional that thinks that's justified. And it's a good thing that this is actually, you know, according to the will of God. So delusional, actually believes that. But when we cut through, so I'm speaking of different desires, right? For the sake of world peace, some people are engaging in acts of terrorism. For the sake of world peace, some people are working for Greenpeace, trying to preserve the natural environment. But the same motivation, for the sake of world peace, that we all could be happy, you know. And so we find a lot not to empathize with as we look at the expressions of people's desires, their behavior, the way they speak and so forth. A lot that we find repugnant, repellent, evil, appalling. But if we can get down there, get down beneath the surface of the acculturation, the configurations, the kind of upbringing, the doctrines, the belief systems, the values that people learn through the course of life. And if we can see you, if you could actually, if any of us could look into the eyes of a member of ISIS who's absolutely committed to that cause, look into their eyes and say, I see you. That would be something, wouldn't it? Not that I see a terrible, repugnant person who should spend the rest of his life in prison, but I see you on a level where I can empathize. That would be quite something, wouldn't it? And not airy-fairy, nothing ooey-gooey about this. This would be kind of deep. And likewise, Trump, to be able to look into Trump's eyes. I'm not saying he's an evil man, I'm just saying this is a lot of opinion in America. My opinion is kind of irrelevant. But to be able to look in this man's eyes, and I see you. I see someone who's fundamentally like myself. I see where we're in the same bandwidth, and I completely empathize with you. Not your opinions, not what you say, not your behavior, a lot of it. But I see you. I empathize with you. That would be quite remarkable. But then how can we tap into that depth of another person if we've not tapped into the depth ourselves? You know, I think if we haven't, then we'll just see the differences. I like this person, don't like this person. And as I mentioned before, Geshe Rabten, the first one to sit down with me one-on-one and give me meditation instruction. This is one of the first two meditations he taught me, equanimity. And he said, all the problems of your life are coming from the absence of this. I like you, I don't like you. You know, that's it on that. And I told you before, years later when I was a monk in Switzerland with him, and I mentioned, oh, I like this person. He said, that's not for you. You know, I like this person, I don't like this person. That's not for you. Really something, isn't it? So, to tap into the side of the mind means to come consciously, here's my interpretation. It's open to interpretation. I'm sure some of the people disagree with me, and welcome to, but for the time being I'm going to hold to this because it seems very meaningful to me. To come to that state where you're resting in your own nucleus, your relative nucleus, your ground state within samsara, the substrate consciousness, explicitly experiencing its bliss, its luminosity, its non-conceptuality. And finding that bliss that is not hedonic, just as described there in the Therigatha. Then how do we get there? What's the most direct route? Because there are many routes. Well, I would suggest, within this context right now, there are two. There are two. And one is the one that Panchen Rinpoche discussed first, and Tsongkhapa refers to explicitly, and that is turn your awareness right in upon the sheer luminosity and sheer cognizance of your own awareness. Just follow right in upon your own awareness by way of its distinctive characteristics. Do not add anything to it. Keep it simple, and that's it. Like that. And following that fragrance of luminosity and cognizance, which you can experience today. That's not an attainment later on. Your mind is already luminous and clear. So there's no reason why you can't identify that. Then that's the fragrance. Just follow that. Keep it simple. Keep it real simple. Just withdraw from all appearances and invert your awareness right in upon the sheer clarity, the luminosity, the brightness of your awareness, that which illuminates, and the experience of knowing, and just rest there until you're home. So that's one method. Very straightforward. So Tsongkhapa said all he needed, he gave like just the pith instruction, the bullet point, without elaborating on the practice at all. Focus on the sheer luminosity, the sheer cognizance of awareness, and that's what he had to say. And that's sufficient, right? Now the other one, of course, is we are attending as if from afar to the thoughts, images, various things that appear in the space of the mind. There's a directionality. We're attending to the space and whatever arises within it. We follow that practice you're pretty familiar with already. Over time, the plane of the mind becomes less and less populated until eventually it's just a sheer vacuity. All of your senses have imploded, your mind has gone silent, your mind has disappeared, you invert your awareness away from the substrate into the substrate consciousness, welcome home. That was that. Okay, that's the second method. Now, a final point that occurred to me, because I'd like to give you a handle when I said I don't have a technique for the very legitimate question that's come up from a number of you. And that is when you're resting in this utter simplicity of awareness, how do you know whether you're just sitting there with a blank mind, which means you could be cultivating stupor, which leads to becoming stupid, as you well know. You could be doing that, or you could be practicing authentically, which will lead to the substrate consciousness, which will be this, the on-ramp to Vipashyana and the freeway to enlightenment. So that's a big difference. Tweak it one way, it goes to stupor and stupidity, and tweak it another way, it goes to awakening. So that's kind of an important distinction to be able to make. And it is subtle. So it occurred to me, I can give you a handle. I'll give you two handles. And that is when you're attending the space of the mind. Okay, you're doing settling the mind in its natural state. Got it? You're attending to the space of the mind, whatever arises. But on occasion, you can't see whether anything's arising. Right? It's intervals in it. No, I'm not getting no signal, just space of the mind. So when you're resting there during intervals, and sometimes as you go more deeply into the practice, those intervals will get longer. Right? You just don't pick up anything. You are attending. How do you know whether you're actually ascertaining the space of the mind? Whether you're on target, ascertaining the target, the space of the mind and its contents, how do you know whether you're doing that or just sitting there like a deer staring into the headlights, spacing out, cultivating once again stupor? Big difference. I can tell you how. You ready? So you might want to remember it because I think this is actually useful. Here's how. How can you test yourself? And here's how. It's a test, like an exam at the end of a course. As you're attending there, and for the time being you're not seeing any events arising in the space of the mind, if an event arises, whatever it is, thought, image, whatever, something appearing to you, as soon as that event arises, if you're spot on, you're already there. We say, Johnny on the spot, okay, in American English. You're already there where it's coming up. Like the cat staring at the mouse hole. As soon as the mouse little whiskers come out, the cat sees it. Not later, okay? If that's the case, if you're so spot on that as soon as the thought or an image comes, some appearance comes, you're right there already. You don't have to pull your attention back. Then you were there before it happened. You were cognizant, you were sustaining cognizance, and that's the indicator of it. When something did come up, you immediately cognize it. If you cognize it only seconds later, that means you're spacing out, you're dull, or you're wandering. Okay? So you have a criterion then. Now, but how about this one, where you're not attending the space of the mind, you're withdrawing from all appearances, you're just attending to the sheer luminosity, sheer cognizance of your own awareness. How do you know now whether you're spacing out or spacing in, or whether you're sustaining flow cognizance and knowing the experience of knowing? And here's the handle. But I think if you pause for a moment, you'd figure it out yourself at this point. There you are resting and just being aware. Or maybe you're just spacing out, or spacing in, just sitting in there with blank mind. How do you know? Here's the test. As soon as a subjective impulse comes up, a thought, a desire, an emotion, any subjective impulse comes up, if as soon as it comes up, you get it, like that fast, you're right there, then you are on the mark. Then you're on the mark. If you learn about it only, seconds later, oh, my mind was on it, oh, I say I want this, oh, I'm feeling this. Later, that means during that interval, you're not on target. And then you have to pull yourself back. Okay? So those are criteria. Oh yeah. So remember the Cook Sutta. That's a good one. Wallace. Let's have a session. I mentioned earlier, I'm going to take a little quick foray over to the west, actually here, Tuscany, in our mind's eye. That Galileo, as a boy, his family, he was born in Pisa. Family lived in Pisa, but then when he was 8 years old, they moved off to Florence, and which is, I think is not very far from here. And then, not long after that, then his father was a musician, wanted to get his son to have some education, and this was in the 16th century. The place that a boy or teenager, adolescent can get an education was pretty much monasteries, like in Tibet until very recently. And so the monastery where his father sent him was the Kamaldoli. Did I pronounce it right? Kamaldoli. Thank you. Kamaldoli. It sounds much better when you say it. It's the Kamaldoli Hermitage and Monastery. It was founded way back in the 11th century. So it was already like 500 years old by the time he was there. It's quite a famous and quite an extraordinary hermitage. It's still there, and it's still operative. And I've seen only photos. I tried to get there last year, and the person who was driving me lost our way, and we never got there. So I didn't get to see it. But Kamaldoli. And so he was there until he was ready for college. And as I mentioned before, he wanted to stay. In the Christian tradition, as I've detailed in my book, Mind in the Balance, Going back to the Greek Orthodox contemplatives in the 13th century, back to the Desert Fathers, they had a practice of awareness of awareness. They don't need a foreign import. It was already there. So just imagine, I'm just being playful here now, but imagine if young Galileo, who knows, maybe he was, I don't know what they taught him. The reports are that he really loved it there. He wanted to spend the rest of his life in a contemplative monastery, becoming a contemplative, right? So who knows, he may have been taught. He could have been taught awareness of awareness there. But just imagine that they did. We're just being playful here. Imagine that he did, and imagine that his father wasn't so tight. I mean, world history could have been different. If his father had just said, son, you want to remain a contemplative, go for it, kid. And let him stay. And imagine if Galileo had stayed and ascertained the sign of his own mind. I would say one thing, from my perspective, one thing's basically certain. If you've ascertained, if you've achieved Shamatha, you've ascertained this bliss that comes from the nature of your own awareness itself, the last thing you'd be interested in would be rolling balls down a ramp. Or wondering whether Jupiter has moons. You say, like, why would anybody care about that? Why look out there? But his father wouldn't pay for it. Father told him to get a job, go to school, become a doctor. And doctor because it paid more than being a mathematician. He had to pay for dowries. He had to pay for get his daughters married. It was a big deal back then. But so Galileo turned his attention outwards, and of course he did not invent, but he made his own telescope based on models from Holland, which means that before he directed his telescope and started doing his amazing discoveries, he knew a telescope inside and out. There was probably just no aspect of a telescope he didn't understand. He made it himself. He polished the lenses. He mounted them. He went from an 8-power to a 20-power to a 30-power telescope in his lifespan. So he clearly knew telescopes of that level of sophistication of his time. So he knew exactly what he's looking through, which makes really good sense. He would have been a real dumbbell if somebody had just given him one that said, look through this, you'll find a lot of cool things. And he didn't examine what he's looking through to note whether it's a telescope or a kaleidoscope. You'll see very different things, of course. So he had good reason to believe that the observations he would make through his telescope would be ones that would actually tell him about the phenomena he was observing. Right? But as far as we know from the records of Galileo's life, while he understood the telescope very well, there's no clear indication he understood the sign of his own mind. So the rest is history. We have now 400 years of this tremendous growth of knowledge of the outside world and tremendous growth of hedonic well-being, a lot of medicine. It's tremendously helpful. I wouldn't be alive for it. Without Western medicine, I would have died when I was a kid. But that 400 years has given us almost nothing for eudaimonia and has left us almost entirely in dark about the nature of the mind. And there are major scientists, and I could quote them, but I won't, that say, do not count, do not rely upon your first-person experience. Do not rely on introspection. Do not rely upon your own perception. This is misleading. You're hallucinating. Everything you experience is illusion. Do not rely on your own first-person experience. It's totally unreliable. And what they're saying is, rely only on us, the scientists, because we're objective, and if you're not a scientist, you're subjective. Very sad. But we don't have to fall there. We don't have to choose. So by the way, this Kamaldoli monastery is just 35 kilometers southeast of Florence. So it's kind of, if you had a really big arm, it's just a stone's throw away from here. So this is where it happened. This is where it happened, in this incredible environment. So that's everything to be recorded. And then just a brief note, very, very brief, time to go. But just, if you're willing to respond to the request, the young man who made the request, his name is Munkbatter, or Muki for short. Munkbatter.